Lord, remind them that you appointed them to their work, and they are accountable to you. May they not forget that you are the supreme judge of the universe, in whose presence humanity must one day stand. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. There you go.
Thank you very much. Senator from Iowa.
I ask to speak in morning business for 1 minute.
Without objection.
As Democrats in the House of Representatives work to pass Speaker Pelosi's prescription drug bill, I remind my colleagues that for any bill to become law, it must be bipartisan, and President Trump must be able to sign it. Unlike current House efforts, the Grassley-Wyden Prescription Drug Pricing Reduction Act fits the bill. It's bipartisan, and President Trump has endorsed it. My Republican colleagues in the House recently pointed to it, in other words, the Grassley-Wyden bill, during an Energy and Commerce Committee hearing as the only path forward to lower prescription drug prices. I welcome this support from Republicans in the House of Representatives. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
This week will provide an opportunity for our Democratic colleagues to prove that their longstanding goal of impeaching the president is not getting in the way of their ability to legislate. The Speaker of the House and the Democratic leader have taken pains to insist that their party's impeachment obsession will not block important business for the American people. Well, we're going to find out. As soon as the Senate completes the domestic funding legislation we're currently considering, we'll turn back toward national defense and give Senate Democrats another chance to advance the funding for our armed forces, which they chose to filibuster just last month. In other words, this week will bring a litmus test. Are Washington Democrats so consumed by impeachment that they cannot even fund our men and women in uniform? Do our service members really need to be pawns in the Democrats' fight with the White House? It's hard to imagine a more basic legislative responsibility than funding the Department of Defense. We need to fund the tools and training that our men and women in uniform need to carry out their missions. We need to give our military commanders the resources to keep pace with major competitors like China, which has nearly doubled its military spending over the past decade. In recent days, our Democrat colleagues have publicly railed against the administration's approach to Syria and the Middle East, without, I would note, offering much of a strategy of their own. But if they vote to block defense funding later this week, they will literally be obstructing the very funding to carry out the missions they say are so important. The last few days have shown us especially clearly that American forces remain in harm's way every day, and their missions do not pause just because some politicians don't find it convenient to fund them. We owe the Pentagon the budgetary certainty it needs to maintain the readiness of our military forces and invest in the capabilities needed to sustain our military edge into the future. We also need to be good, reliable partners to our friends and allies. So get this, Madam President, this appropriations bill would fund $250 million in military assistance for Ukraine under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. If that sounds familiar, that would be the exact same program that Democrats are currently trying to impeach the president for allegedly slow walking. So welcome to Washington, where Democrats try to impeach President Trump for supposedly slow-walking aid for Ukraine and simultaneously filibuster the funding for the exact same Ukraine program here in the Senate. Welcome to Washington. I think it's safe to say that would elevate irony to a whole new art form. So I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope instead that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will land on the same side when it comes to support for the men and women who keep us safe and for our vulnerable international partners who look to us for leadership. Now, on another matter, this week we will vote on another effort by our Democratic colleagues to undo successful Trump administration policy. In recent days, our colleagues across the aisle have forced two failed votes on similar resolutions. One would have cut taxes for the wealthiest residents of blue states at the expense of working families everywhere else. The other would have resurrected an Obama-era proposal to bury American energy under red tape. Both those efforts failed, but our Democratic colleagues are back at it with another bad policy. This time, they'd like to reverse Trump administration guidance that has reduced health care premiums for American families and reaffirm protections for those with pre-existing conditions. So, Madam President, Section 1332 of Obamacare gives states the opportunity to escape some of that law's worst burdens. States have the opportunity to apply for waivers that allow for more types of health insurance plans and more options for consumers. More than a dozen states have already had these waivers approved, not just red states. Democratic governors in places like Colorado, Delaware, and Rhode Island have applied for and received these waivers. Where governors of both parties are embracing this opportunity, good things are happening. According to one analysis, the 7 states where new waivers were implemented during the Trump administration have seen premiums decline by 7.5%. The Trump administration guidance continues this success and gives states even more of what they asked for, even more flexibility to escape Obamacare's burdens, more choices for consumers, and lower premiums. But apparently, our Democratic colleagues are not terribly fond of letting states shake off the unhelpful strictures of Obamacare. Perhaps it makes their signature law look bad that governors of both parties are so eager to escape from it. But that can't be their public argument, so in their effort to reduce this flexibility, some Democrats are rehashing tired old claims about a conspiracy to hurt Americans with pre-existing conditions. Republicans have been clear, and we've been consistent. We support protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. The CMS Administrator, Seema Verma, has specifically stated that, quote, a Section 1332 waiver cannot undermine coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. That's the head of CMS. In fact, it is this Trump administration policy that will help American families, including those with pre-existing conditions, by helping to bring down the soaring premiums and restore the dwindling options that Obamacare's failures have brought about. So I would urge the Senate to reject this misguided resolution. We don't need a health care policy from the supporters of Medicare for none. Democrats' grand scheme to take away the health insurance plans of 180 million Americans and replace it with one-size-fits-all government plans. Americans deserve more say, not less. On one final matter, when I joined President Trump last year as he signed the Farm Bill, we marked a new chapter for an historic American crop. In a victory for growers, processors, and manufacturers across the country, especially in my state of Kentucky, the initiative for full hemp legalization became law. Now, this morning, the U.S. Department of Agriculture plans to take the important next step. Secretary Perdue will release a new USDA regulation to implement my initiative and move hemp closer to being treated just like every other commodity. This new policy will help farmers around the country continue pioneering this crop into the 21st century. And I'm proud to say Kentucky is prepared to take the lead. For generations, our growers and producers have made the bluegrass state an agricultural powerhouse, well positioned at the forefront of hemp's resurgence. Following the downturn in tobacco, it was my tobacco buyout legislation that helped farmers transition toward new opportunities. And a growing number are looking to this past crop, one grown by Washington, Jefferson, and Henry Clay, as they plan for the future. As the buyout payments came to an end, I secured the creation of hemp pilot programs in the 2014 Farm Bill, empowering farmers and researchers to begin a multi-year experiment with hemp's capabilities. Thanks to leaders like Agriculture Commissioner Ryan Quarles and his predecessor, now Congressman James Comer, Kentucky was leading the charge. The results were clear. The pilot program was working, so we knew the 2018 Farm Bill had to take the next step. I'm grateful to Agriculture Committee Chairman Pat Roberts, who included my hemp initiative in the bill that is now law. I'd also like to thank the many members on both sides of the aisle, including Senator Ron Wyden, who've helped in the effort as well. My hemp provisions in the Farm Bill directed USDA to craft a new regulatory framework so hemp could be cultivated nationwide, and with each state given the opportunity to develop its own plan for hemp oversight. I'm grateful Secretary Perdue accepted my invitation for a Kentucky hemp tour so he could see our progress up close and learn from Kentucky hemp farmers and regulators as USDA developed its policies. This year alone, hemp is growing on more than 26,000 acres in Kentucky across 101 of our 120 counties. It supports hundreds of jobs and tens of millions in sales. So I impressed upon USDA the need to finalize this new framework before the 2020 growing season. And I'd like to thank Secretary Perdue and the USDA for fulfilling this commitment with the announcement we're expecting later this morning. I look forward to reviewing USDA's guidelines and hearing from hemp stakeholders around Kentucky. Now, our work to support the future of hemp is hardly over. There are ongoing conversations with the FDA on CBD products, ongoing work to help growers and retailers to access credit and financial products. There will inevitably be ups and downs as this new industry develops, but today's announcement is another crucial step. So it's a privilege for me to stand with Kentucky farmers every step of the way. Together, we'll continue charting hemp's course well into the future.
Leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of H.R. 3055, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 141, H.R. 3055, an act making appropriations for the Departments of Commerce and Justice, Science, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2020, and for other purposes.
Senator from Illinois?
Are we in quorum call?
No, we're not.
Thank you. Madam President, I want to comment on an incident that occurred late last week on the floor of the Senate regarding temporary protected status, known as TPS, for people from the country of Venezuela. TPS can be provided by the president to nationals of a country when that country is experiencing a violence or a catastrophe that makes returning to the country unsafe. This is a protection offered by America under many different administrations to help those who might be in the United States when a calamity occurs in their home countries. It has often been granted for countries suffering outbreaks of war or natural disaster, which leads me to the issue of Venezuela. Currently, the United States is working with regional partners to foster an end to the disastrous dictatorial regime still clinging to power in Venezuela. I was there last year, and I saw what was heartbreaking, considering that this was once a proud Latin American democracy. People are literally starving in Venezuela. They faint in the workplace from lack of nutrition. Hospitals don't have electric power or the most basic medicines. I visited a children's hospital in Caracas, and they told me they didn't have antibiotics or the basic cancer drugs necessary for the children who came to their hospital. Millions are fleeing Venezuela as refugees into neighboring countries. There's brutal political repression. Opposing dictator Maduro is a virtual guarantee of house arrest or worse. Staggering government corruption and a systematic dismantling of that country's democracy are taking place on a regular basis and resulted in election results which were incredible and not believed by anyone in the region when they were announced a few months back. I've been supportive of this administration's efforts to work with other nations to support the interim presidency of Juan Guaido and provide assistance to the millions of fleeing Venezuelans. And though I fear this issue has escaped President Trump's attention, one simple step that he can take is to grant temporary protected status to Venezuelans currently in the United States. Some are here as students, others are here on work visas, but they are on temporary status. What I'm asking the president to do is to give them temporary protected status so that they wouldn't have to return to Venezuela while the danger still lurks. Despite repeated requests by myself and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, President Trump has repeatedly refused. He goes to audiences in Florida and talks about confronting the Venezuelan dictatorship. Then he turns around and refuses to give protection to the Venezuelans in the United States who need this protection. Ironically, while the President's Department of State has issued travel warnings advising Americans not to visit Venezuela because of the danger, this president still won't protect Venezuelans within the United States who are afraid to return. I've met many such Venezuelans in my home state of Illinois, and I can tell you they are desperately worried about returning to the chaos, violence, and hopelessness of the current Venezuela. Since the White House refuses to act, the House of Representatives passed a bipartisan bill granting temporary protected status to Venezuelans this last July by a 272 to 158 margin. Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, Marco Rubio of Florida, and I have introduced a similar Senate bill. But the Majority Leader, McConnell, refuses to bring up any bill that might not meet the approval of President Donald Trump, even a bill offered by leaders in his own political party. Senator Menendez and I have tried to call up the House bill for passage only to face objection repeatedly from Senate Republicans. Last week, to deflect blame from President Trump and the Senate Republicans who object to our bill, the junior senator from Florida came to the floor with his own approach. He blocked the bipartisan House Venezuela TPS bill from passing and offered a dubious amendment undermining TPS for others as the price for helping the Venezuelans. In other words, he said, well, perhaps we could help Venezuelans as long as it's at the expense of others who are in similar status from other countries. His proposal would in fact significantly weaken the entire temporary protected status program. For example, his proposal would require congressional approval of any extension of TPS beyond the original period, and it would limit such extension to an arbitrary 18-month period. Ultimately, the junior senator from Florida's proposal is using the plight of Venezuelans to basically gut the existing temporary protected status program. We've seen folks on the other side of the aisle resort to this when it came to DACA. Republicans in the Senate trying to use a vulnerable population, such as the young people who were raised here in the United States and want a chance to work their way to citizenship, to use those vulnerable populations as bargaining chips for an anti-immigrant agenda. Once again, these members are simply refusing to stand up to the president when he fails on these issues. The solution indeed is simple. This administration should grant temporary protected status on its own to the Venezuelan, but it refuses. Senate Republicans could pass the bipartisan House bill to grant Venezuelans temporary protected status, but the Senate Republicans refuse. So let everyone be clear where the real failure to help Venezuelans actually rests. Madam President, later today, at the request of the Republicans on the Senate side, I'll be making a unanimous consent request relative to the health care issue, which was raised by Senator McConnell earlier. I'm told they're not quite ready this morning, so I'm going to defer that offer until later in the day when they will be ready, and we can have a colloquy on the floor of the United States Senate. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President,
Democratic leader,
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
we're not in a quorum.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, Madam President, even as the Senate works through a grouping of appropriations bills here on the floor this week, the Republican leader has been falsely accusing Democrats of delaying the overall process. He just seems to be in a box and pulls things out of thin air. The crux of the issue, as everybody knows, is that the Republican leadership in the Senate and on the Appropriations Committee has refused to sit down and negotiate with Democrats on bipartisan allocations to the various agencies. This has always how we have done the appropriations bills when we've succeeded. Democrats and Republicans sit down together and negotiate the 302As and Bs. But here, the Republicans, without consultation of the Democrats, just unilaterally proposed taking over $12 billion from critical health programs and military families to pay for the president's border wall, a wall that President Trump promised Mexico would pay for. Democrats, of course, are not going to proceed to a defense bill that steals from our troops to pay for a border wall the American people don't want and aren't supposed to pay for. But in this Republican Hall of Mirrors, that means Democrats are delaying a pay raise for our troops, quote unquote, as the leader charged yesterday, even though that's not true. And I believe that he knows very well. I believe he knows very well that the pay raise is strongly bipartisan. The truth is simple. As the leader knows, the annual pay raise will go into effect regardless of whether we pass defense appropriations or the NDAA. In fact, the Department of Defense just confirmed to the Senate Democratic appropriators yesterday that the pay raise for our troops will take effect on January 1st without requiring any further legislation. The troops and their families will see a 3.1% pay raise in January. I know that the president ties the majority leader in a box, in a knot, and he sort of flails around and doesn't know how to get out of it because he's afraid to tell President Trump what he's doing won't pass. But instead, he blames Democrats. That seems to be his wont these days. But it's just totally false. Not according to just me, but according to the Department of Defense. And then he even went a step further. In the Republican Hall of Mirrors, Democrats might even, quote, be delaying military assistance for Ukraine. Can you believe this, that the majority leader would say something like this? The comment's laughable. It was the Trump administration that delayed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of already appropriated, urgently needed military assistance to Ukraine earlier this year, a fact now being investigated by the House Impeachment Inquiry. The fact of the matter is the only purported delay in the appropriations process is Republicans insisting on taking our money, our military, taking money from our military to spend on a border wall, something Democrats won't countenance. That's it. If the Republican appropriators dropped that request and sat down with Democrats to negotiate a bipartisan way forward, which is the only way appropriations can proceed, I'm sure we could line up the rest of the bills for the year. So let's cut the nonsense. Leader McConnell, have the honor and decency and courage to tell President Trump he's going to bollox up the whole process again, just as he did last time. We can roll up our sleeves and get to work if you would do just that. We're already working on the non-controversial bills. We could do it for the rest, if and when our Republican friends decide to meet us halfway. Now on health care. Tomorrow, Senate Democrats will use a provision of the Congressional Review Act to force a vote on one of the most crucial policy questions we faced all session, the future of health care protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. The Trump administration has tried several different ways to undermine these protections and sabotage our health care system. And one of the most damaging efforts is this rule that gives the states the green light to use taxpayer dollars to push junk health insurance plans. These plans are hardly worth the paper they're printed on. Many don't cover maternity care, prescription drugs, mental health, or preventative services. And many could offer insurance companies a way around the requirement to pay for your treatment if you develop a pre-existing condition. Just imagine. Sign up for one of these plans and then you discover that your child's heart condition or cancer or life-saving prescription drugs weren't covered it when you need it most? That shouldn't be allowed to happen. Republicans and this administration are trying to allow it to happen. As you can imagine, Many insurance companies love the idea. Data from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners shows that the top 3 companies that issue these junk plans spend barely 40% of premiums on health care. Just 40%. Just think about that. Republicans want to use taxpayer dollars to fund these junk plans. Is that money going towards paying for people's health care? No. It's going to pad insurance company profits. Tomorrow, the Senate will face a simple choice on whether or not to defend protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. My Republican friends can either stand with the Trump administration and use taxpayer dollars to pad profits for insurance companies, or stand up for American families who struggle to afford health care. Finally, on climate. Last week, I announced a bold new plan to rapidly phase out gas-powered vehicles for clean vehicles. We need a plan of this scale and ambition to reduce one of the largest drivers of carbon emissions, transportation, while at the same time creating tens of thousands of new jobs and reinvigorating American auto manufacturing. Predictably, the deep-pocketed special interests in big oil and gas are already lining up to oppose this plan. Over the years, big oil and big gas have spent millions of dollars in lobbying to kill climate-friendly legislation and protect their bottom lines. A headline ran yesterday announcing, quote, "Big oil gears up to fight Schumer electric vehicle plan." Well, I have 3 words for big oil. Bring it on. Bring it on because this fight is too important. Climate change is happening right now, and it's resulting in more severe weather, sea level rise, and drastic changes to our agriculture. As we speak, California is suffering from some of the worst wildfires it's ever seen. Scientists tell us if we do not take drastic action to alter our current path, we'll not be able to avoid the most damaging consequences of climate change. Bring it on, because this plan is supported not only by the environmental community and climate action groups, but by labor unions like the UAW, the IBEW, and the whole AFL-CIO, and by large automakers like Ford and GM. They all know that the future is moving towards clean cars, and we ought to get there before China and create tens of thousands of new, good-paying jobs right here in the U.S. Bring it on. If the special interests of big oil and gas want to oppose thousands of good-paying jobs for American workers, if they want to oppose America leading the world in the industries of the future, if they want to oppose protecting our planet for our children and grandchildren, they are on the wrong side of history, and we will fight them every single step of the way. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, I ask that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'm delighted that the Senate is taking up 4 very important appropriations bills. One of them I discussed at length last week. That is the Transportation and HUD Appropriations Bill, which I authored along with my ranking member, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. In forging that bill, we gathered information from 75 of our fellow senators who had 950 requests. We went through each of the requests very carefully, and we have built a bill that is truly bipartisan, that reflects the priorities of this body, and that I trust will be approved as part of this package later this week. I also want to take the opportunity today, as I'm managing the 4 bills in the unavoidable absence of the full committee chairman, Senator Shelby, to talk about some of the other appropriations bills that have been brought before us. As the presiding officer is well aware, the Appropriations Committee is a committee that makes a real effort to work together, to put aside petty partisanship, and instead listen to one another and work for the common good. We make an extraordinary effort to find common ground. How I wish that could be done throughout Washington today. But the Appropriations Committee remains a bastion of common sense, of collegiality, and of working together to seek common ground. And that's why we've had such success in reporting so many of the appropriations bills. And I'm very proud that the T-HUD bill, as we call the Transportation and Housing Bill, was one of those that was reported unanimously by a vote of 31-0. For the next few moments, I would like to talk about another bill that had unanimous support on the committee, and that is the CJS Appropriations Bill, Commerce, Justice, and State. Let me begin by acknowledging the hard work of the chairman, Senator Moran, and the ranking member, Senator Shaheen, for their work in balancing the many priorities that are included in this bill. Once again, we saw the chairman and the ranking member working together as a team in a bipartisan, indeed a nonpartisan way, in order to find common ground. I'd like to comment on a few of the provisions of the bill that I think are particularly important. First, I'm encouraged that the bill continues to provide strong support for the National Sea Grant College program, despite the administration's desire to eliminate this program. The committee actually provided an increase of $7 million over last year's funding level. The University of Maine Sea Grant program is a national leader in ocean research, an issue that I know is very important to the presiding officer from Florida as well. Within the Sea Grant program, there is $2 million for critical lobster research, building on the $2 million that was included last year. The Sea Grant program recently announced 7 research awards supported by this funding, 4 of which were awarded to Maine entities in recognition of their extraordinary expertise and research. These investments will help us to better understand how the lobster stock is reacting to changing environmental conditions and ensure that this iconic industry, indeed one of the very symbols of the state of Maine, continues to thrive. The problem is that we're seeing increasing warming of the Gulf of Maine. In fact, it is warming the second fastest of any body of water in the world, Mr. President. And that has brought new kinds of sea life. For example, an invasive green crab that never existed in Maine waters. So we're watching the impact very carefully, and particularly on our lobster industry. I'm also glad that the bill prioritizes the development of technologies to better track the right whale population. Now, the number of right whales is problematic. While it is not as low as it was a few years ago, it is still troublesome that the population continues to be under stress. The NOAA Fisheries has targeted the Maine lobster industry with potentially very onerous right whale regulations, despite the government's inability to adequately monitor the movement of these right whales. Mr. President, we must better understand where the right whales are and where they are not. And this, too, is important in terms of our warming waters. The major food supply for the right whales has moved to the north, towards Canada. And that's why the entanglements that we've seen, which we all deplore, have involved Canadian gear. And I think that is very important to recognize. There have also been some Canadian ship strikes. Mr. President, our lobster men and women have been such careful stewards of the resource, and that has been true for generations. Lobstering is often a family business, passed on from generation to generation. The lobster men and women of Maine care deeply about our lobster stocks and about ensuring that lobsters are there for generations to come. And they have been extraordinary conservationists. They invented the V-notching of lobsters, the sizing to make sure that lobsters that are big and breeders are tossed overboard, or those that are too small are returned to the water. Unfortunately, our Canadian counterparts often do not follow those same cooperative conservation measures. And there is an area off the coast of Maine that is known as the gray zone, where it is in dispute whose waters, whether it's the United States or Canada, the gray zone is. And what we find is we'll find American and Canadian lobstermen both in that area or close by. And our lobstermen and women following strict conservation methods, such as throwing back the lobsters that are too